So in society, we've seen some realizations of communism, or at least some attempts at communism. And some of the best case studies we have, of course, starting with the Soviet Union. You have 1917 when the communist Russian Revolution occurred with the Bolsheviks. So they took control. Their idea was, of course, this redistribution of wealth, taking down the czars of Russia, this elite class that has been ruling over them and subjugating. And they had a really hard time in World War One, and it really kind of drew this with all the shortages and all the ways that the extreme poverty and the oppression of war drove the working class to really rise against the czars and take over. So Lenin was the first Bolshevik ruler, but then you have Stalin that took over in 1928 when Lenin died, and he instituted this thing called 5-year plans, and he wanted to boost industrial and agricultural production, but he made all the decisions. It was really trying to bring the USSR, or the Soviet Union, into this national power and prestige in the world. Make them an industrial powerhouse. So they took all the best land, labor, and capital and gave it to armed forces and heavy industry, really utilized those aspects to kind of bring that powerhouse around. But then you gave all lower quality goods to consumers, to the people. And the people were forced to work in these factories and these industries. It started to have a really unequal and not equally distributed kind of feeling to it. So severe shortages started to happen and to occur. So then there's kind of trying to look at the agriculture aspect, put farmers on large state-run farms, took away all private property in farms, and the government supplied all the materials and then set the wages based on their job and their performance. But they really struggled to get enough out of this production to even feed his own people. And it was one of the big struggles of the USSR. And so eventually, even with this devotion to military, trying to become a world superpower and what we would consider the Cold War, and how we kind of looked at them as the opposing of the USA, they really in reality were quite economically weak. And this became very apparent as that economic weakness and instability continued to grow leading up into the 1990s with the fall of the USSR and the Berlin Wall. When you look at USSR and you look at this idea of incentive and what drives, so incentive, as we learned in the free market, really drove it. You are incentivized. When you go to work, you get money. Woo, payday. We are incentivized to work harder if we're given, bonuses and promises of promotions or increased pay or whatever it might be. So we want to work harder. Well, if you know that no matter what you do, your job is going to be hard, you're never going to increase in pay, and the government's going to just basically give you everything anyway, no matter if you meet your quota or you fail it, well then, are you just going to put your feet up and relax and do whatever you want? Or you're not going to work harder. Why work harder? It's work harder. Don't work harder, but work smarter. Well, in the USSR, you basically always end up working smarter. So because people did not have the individual, personal incentive to increase production and work hard and devote to that, it really made the USSR struggle. So another example is going to be China, another great powerhouse of the communist world. And in China, they really started having their revolution quite a few years later in 1949, the Red Revolution. So at the beginning, they did allow private land, a little bit of private ownership, tried to build these small factories, produce goods and services. But everything was really expensive to produce and then really came out poor quality. So it was really not great distribution amongst the people. So they tried to take this struggle and tried to overcome it. So in the 1950s, they took away a lot of private land and actually forced these peasants onto these farming communes. And as you can see pictured here, they would just be on the state-owned land and all work in this little collective. And what they did is then they kind of had to adjust, but after that adjust and those severe, when they actually started to give control of the communes on these local workers, so they created this little microcosm where not only were they producing for the country, but they got to produce for themselves and take care of themselves. They got to decide about their commune allocation of their goods that they produced, and then other excess goods went into basically the collective pool of the country. But because they had control over what they were getting, there was an incentive there. They had some payoff that they benefited from their hard work. And when that happened, it solved the shortages. People were fed. Now, is it perfect? Not completely. The economy still struggles and stumbles and has its pitfalls, and did need some economic turnaround change in the 1970s with, if you've ever learned of the Tank Man and the Tiananmen Square and like the student revolution of the 1970s, where they were looking for more choice and incentive and free market exchange, they gave in to that. They gave farmers more chance to own land. They gave private entrepreneurs chance to own businesses. They also gave, foreign investors a chance to come in. They offered bonuses for factory managers, making better quality choices. So they really started to boost on the incentive. The incentive drove China's growth. And so they started to see a huge turnaround. In China today, even though the Chinese government still owns a major portion of the farming industries and any of the other economic industries and financial industries, there's still a little bit of more incentive that continues to go. Government planners control the key economic decisions, but it's like they decide when and how they're going to let go to individuals and businesses and firms to make those decisions that will best benefit China and overall the economic standing of China. So with this more freedom that they're given, with, of course, the government oversight that is still heavily present, they're becoming a world superpower. I mean, pretty much like half the world owes money to China, and they produce half of the exports throughout the world, which is a big thing that people kind of are like, paying attention to. Now, in all these samples that we looked at, we're moving further left on the free market scale, further and further away from free market, and that there needs to be something that drives people. Well, USSR, China, Cuba, communist nations specifically, and those more far left, non-free economic systems are going to need something to drive it, and that is authority. So an authoritarian government is a government that has complete and utter control over everything, every aspect of life. And so these realized communist societies have only existed under this authoritarian regime. You have Stalin in Russia, you have, the Chinese government, and you have all these different things. So they limit individual freedom, they're focused on what the government demands, and it's really requiring strict obedience. The incentive really becomes more of an aspect of your life and your kind of perceived loyalty to the regime than your economic incentive. So you're going to have that domination, and we have not seen a communist nation that has really been in existence without that dominant leadership that controls the society. So even though China has seen some success within its latter years by kind of controlling but not controlling the system, we have seen some disadvantages that, of course, led to falls, like Cuba is moving further and further into more freedoms in their society, but the USSR completely stumbled and collapsed. And the reason is because the disadvantages. You do lack economic efficiency. Incentive really drives that efficiency. Like, why am I going to meet any kind of quota if there's no incentive to do so? So that lack of drive of the working class really halted efficiency. Economic freedom. You don't have freedom of choice within the market and production. Growth is really difficult when you're not doing efficiency. And that production possibility curve that we looked at before, if you can't meet the efficient production, then you're not going to grow. So you're just going to continue to shrink because you're underutilizing all of your goods and needs and underperforming. You may seem that you have quality because that's something that drives this idea to equally distribute wealth. But in every realized circumstance, the political elite class, like the military and your party leaders, are all going to be still a present elite in the society, benefiting more than the masses. And so equality has never been fully and rightfully achieved within these full communist countries. And of course, there's many other kind of goals within this economic structure that really does struggle. Um, we've seen China as a case study that they struggled the least and grew the most once incentive, private ownership, and more of those things of a free market and characteristics started to get introduced. So even though Karl Marx is still applauded today with his idea of communist and the idea of who should have the power within a society, the idea of completely taking away incentives out of society, like profit and consumerism and freedom of choice, really isn't an advantage in that system. And Adam Smith's idea that incentive drives an economic market really has had more success within the existing economic systems of the world. So that is where we're going to end in this one. The next we're going to discuss is how mixed economies work, where you have more like a socialist system, where you have a presence of free market and the presence of government interventions, and how that compares to the other two. So stay tuned.